disability areas. And we know how historically the powerful, whenever they wanted to suppress and silence any population, any group, they used disability to justify that. For example, when they wanted to deny women's rights, they said, "Oh, women do not have the capacity. They are not intellectually developed." Then they wanted to oppress people with different sexual orientation. They also use this argument of this is a disability. So disabilities historically has been used as a weapon to control people, and that by itself shows how ableism is rooted in beliefs and attitudes of many decision makers throughout the history. And of course, immigration is not only an exception, but also actually one of the most dominant areas of American governance by ableism. So if I want to make it simple, I would just say, according to most of the immigration decision makers, lawmakers, policy makers, we have so-called worthy and unworthy immigrant. So, and of course, the definition of worthy immigrant in the attitude of those decision makers is an immigrant who can do the cheap labor, can produce a lot and consume a lot, and don't put any so-called burden on the American society. So people with disabilities were not really welcome as immigrants throughout the American history for three main reasons. First of all, there were, of course, eugenic-based fears, like, oh, these people are gonna come and we're gonna have more people with disabilities in the US, which is, I think, so basically immigrants with disabilities were considered as undesirable immigrants. Secondly, immigrants with disabilities were considered as non-productive and not worthy immigrants. So it was perceived that immigrants with disabilities will not be able to work and will be just using benefits and being a burden on American society. So they should not be coming to this country. And thirdly, because of the danger, that means that there were assumptions about especially certain groups of people with disabilities who may impose risk to the American society. So because of that fear of danger, also immigrants with disabilities were never really welcome throughout the American history. Of course, this is the general rule, and there are exceptions, and I myself, I'm an exception to an immigrant with disability being welcome to this country. I'm going to tell you about it a little bit more later. So these three concerns kind of reflect themselves in the American immigration laws, policies, and practices in many ways. I'm going to spend a few minutes to tell you a few of those ways, because then I'm going to tell you specifically what this administration is doing. But in order to understand what is current administration doing, we all need to make sure that we understand the historic nature and how the laws and policies and practices are shaped. So one concrete example is that according to Immigration and Nationality Act, certain groups of people with so-called, the law uses the word disorder, mental or physical disorder, are not admissible to the United States because they may impose danger to themselves or others. So basically, we have many cases of people with disabilities who have been denied entry to this country because of perceived danger to others or to themselves. Like any indications of self-harm has been caused denial of entrance to the United States. So we have that concrete language in the law that basically those immigrants with mental and physical disabilities who are dangerous for themselves and others should not enter. We also have the ground of public charge, which means that any immigrant who will pose public charge on American society are not allowed in this country. And by public charge, they mean basically anybody who will be using the government benefits, or there is a likelihood to be institutionalized. So that means that many immigrants with disabilities would be considered as public charge and would not be admissible to this country. One thing that I want to highlight, and is actually the cornerstone of understanding how immigrants with disabilities are being excluded from benefiting from immigration in the US, is the fact that immigration law and practice is very much discretionary. So there are many, many occasions, and I mean, I'm not an immigration lawyer, but immigration lawyers can tell us more about it, that there are many occasions that a decision is left to the discretion of the immigration judge or immigration officer, if the case is like a visa application, or if there is, for example, a green card application or naturalization application, very much left for the discretion of that decision maker to see and decide based on a case-by-case basis. And we all know what does that mean for people with disabilities. It means that the stigma, the bias can play its role. And people don't have to really explain how they implemented or applied that discretion, because they can say, okay, based on all the factors, discretionary decide to deny or warrant the immigration benefit requested. So I'm someone who, I mean, in my case, I came to this country based on the diversity visa, like green card lottery. And I honestly think about that moment that I was in my visa interview, because my immigration officer had the discretion to decide if come to this country, am I going to be a public charge? Am I going to be using the government benefits and be a burden to the American society? Or am I going to be what they call a worthy or productive immigrant? And I remember when I was preparing for my interview, people were advising, like, take your financial support documentation, take your employment history, take your education history. And you know, none of these are the requirements for the diversity visa. But I took all of that evidence to my interview without knowing that, to prove to my immigration officer that I'm not gonna be a public charge. I'm gonna be able to work and pay tax and be a good American citizen, productive one, right? So I remember on my interview day that, you know, my immigration officer asked me, okay, so you're gonna go to the United States, do you have any family members or friends there? And I said, no, I don't have anyone. And he said, then how are you gonna survive there? How are you gonna take care of yourself? And I'm like, well, this is not my first immigration, because I have gone to school in London, I have lived in Denmark for a while. And then he said, how are you gonna handle the challenges that you face? I'm like, I have survived, I'm originally from Iran. And I said to him, look, I have survived in a country like Iran with a lot of accessibility challenges, so hopefully US is more accessible. Well, if I didn't answer like that, I don't know if I would have received my visa. My English was good. I was a so-called privileged person with disability who could get education, who could learn English. But imagine if I couldn't answer those questions, if my English wasn't good, if I was not a human rights lawyer, I can imagine that my visa application would be rejected. That's the ableist nature of immigration law policies and practices. We also have other circumstances where this ableist nature is prevailing. For example, I mean, I guess you all have heard of ICE, the Immigration and Custom Enforcement Police, which makes you chill like ice when you meet them. So, you know, we hear a lot of news about them detaining people with disabilities, detaining support people or caregivers of people with disabilities. Unfortunately, they don't publish any information about how many people with disabilities they detain, what are the conditions of the detention center. But what we know is that, especially for people with mental health conditions, the detention situation is not really the greatest, and many of them are actually being kept there for a long time without accessing the accommodation they need. Also, when it comes to immigration courts, again, that immigration judges usually have that very vast discretion that I was just talking about. That's another occasion when many immigrants with disabilities may face ableist attitudes. And also the decision makers in the USCIS, which is responsible to decide about warranting the permanent residence permit or naturalized people with disabilities, they also have a lot of discretion. And like many changes that has happened recently, has just made the situation more difficult. So by that, I'm gonna wrap up and hand over to Anne to tell us how this administration is making it even worse for immigrants with disabilities.